So having cultivated bodhicitta, you can do the verse of refuge in bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Let's see anybody. So, I'll just briefly note that so we're in this studying this title, the explanation of the presentation of objects and object possessors, as well as awareness and knowers by perpetuate. And so I just wanted to note that it's kind of working out well. That I think we have obviously today, and then I think we just need one more class on this text, because part of the text I think we should skip because it's about mind and mental factors, and we're going to switch over anyway to the other text, which I think was distributed, but if people still need it, you can email it out. But mind and mental factors is covered in much greater detail in the other text for this series called by Kachin Yeshe Gelsen's A Necklace for Those of Clear Awareness, revealing the modes of mind and mental factors. So he covers mind and mental factors in much more detail in his text. So I think when I looked at the other transcripts, that seemed to be the pattern, is that they don't cover that section. It would be silly to cover that section of this text, which is quite brief, and then cover it again in a much more detailed way. So I think we'll continue with this text today and next time. And actually, it should work out well then, because that will finish this text in April. May is no class because of Gyubei Khenchen Rinpoche is going to be on the East Coast. So I'm going to be away on the weekends attending teachings by Rinpoche. And then in June, we'll start the other text on mind and mental factors, which is related but slightly different, material. So we'll be able to do that. So I think that'll work well. And then I wanted to reorient us. So what we're covering actually now, right, in this text, are these different ways of knowing. Sometimes, and they're here. I mean, they're all included here. Sometimes they're made a list of 7 ways of knowing. But I wanted to emphasize, because what we're up to now are doubt and wrong consciousness. The last two of those ways of knowing, and then we go on to other divisions. And I just wanted to say, for me personally, in studying this general topic of, about the mind, I found this whole teaching on the 7 ways of knowing to be one of the most useful things from a practice perspective. And also just from a lived perspective of understanding, our actual experience in daily life, understanding ourselves, understanding others. Even though the next topic I guess we should go in order, but I guess I'll just say more comments, right? Because part of the idea, right, is I said at the very beginning of this whole series, right, that one of the ways that both Vignaga and Dharmakirti, who are the 2 most famous Buddhist teachers on pramana, right, valid cognition, or anyway, they're different translations, so I'll call it valid cognition, praise the Buddha as one who is valid, right? That the Buddha sees things as they are. And with wrong consciousness, I want to say wrong consciousness is the most extreme example of seeing things not as they are, right? Seeing things as they are not. And, so you could say that, so this idea, these categories aren't something disconnected from our own experience, right? What we're trying to do is identify our own wrong consciousnesses and change them, right? And part of what this teaching is getting at is that first of all, we have, you and I, we ordinary people have wrong consciousnesses, right? From a spiritual perspective, from a Buddhist perspective, the most important one is self-grasping, right? Which is a wrong consciousness. But then we have limitless other wrong consciousnesses, and they say based on self-grasping, sometimes we say there are limitless elaborations of wrong, of wrong consciousness. And it's, I always joke, right? It's easy to say somebody else has a wrong consciousness. It's hard to identify our own wrong consciousnesses. And I actually, I'm actually, I'm just jumping in very slightly, right? But, it says on our own system, the definition of a wrong consciousness is a knower that engages its object erroneously. And so what I wanted to raise there is, it's quite interesting. I'm just thinking from an experience, and part of what I think is really fascinating, if you look at these different ways of knowing, is, I just want to give countless examples, but part of what I'm getting at here is that, ordinarily, if you're not practicing Dharma, right, you engage something erroneously, and then you just keep engaging erroneously, and you can base your day on that. You can base an entire lifetime on that. You can base countless lifetimes on that, which is what we've done apparently. But I want to give a mundane example. Think about somebody annoys you, and you think, whatever, you think they're a jerk, or they're bad, they're terrible, right? So what I want to go through is an ordinary person who's not practicing Dharma just thinks, yeah, they're a jerk, right? And then they act based on that, right? So that'd be and a human being is not just that. So it's it's probably maybe an exaggerate. Anger exaggerates, right? That's what I'm getting at. So anger exaggerates the negative qualities of the object. So it's a wrong consciousness, right? So we're on page 23, under wrong consciousness. I'll go back to doubt in a minute. So that's an example of a wrong consciousness. But then I want to ask you, if you're practicing Dharma, right, and then somebody annoys you and you think they're a jerk, then what happens, right? Maybe you don't practice Dharma at all, right? You just keep thinking, oh, I don't like this person, they're this and they're that, and what anger does, right? It exaggerates the negative. They're terrible in every way, right? That's an example. Or then you would just stay in wrong consciousness. Or if you're practicing Dharma, then actually it becomes complicated, doesn't it? If you're actually trying to practice, right? Because then you have the thought, right, which is a wrong consciousness. You believe it for a moment, they're terrible, right? And then you think, oh, wait a second, that's hatred. Or that's, that's a mental affliction. Now that actually is a correct consciousness. If you recognize, so you have a wrong consciousness that thinks somebody's all bad, right? Then if you're practicing Dharma, you may recognize, oh, I'm having a mental affliction. That's a correct observation, right? Then in the next moment, you might think, yeah, but they really stink, right? Now you're back to wrong consciousness. Then you think, oh, wow, I'm really caught up in that. That's a correct consciousness. Then you think, well, I don't care that I'm caught up in it. They're really, they did this wrong. Right? My point is right, so then you're going back and forth, right? And then if you try to engage it, right, you might think, well, wait a second, are they really all bad? And then your mind thinks, well, they're pretty bad, Now you're having doubt, right? Well, but they maybe not all bad, right? So it might be doubt leaning in the wrong direction. Well, yeah, they're mostly terrible, but but whatever, one time they helped somebody on the side of the road. Okay, I have to admit that, but that doesn't make them a good person or whatever, whatever you do. But my point is, you see what I'm going at here? It's you can have a wrong consciousness, then you can have a correct consciousness that's recognizing you're having a wrong consciousness, but then the wrong consciousness reasserts itself. But if you want to actually work with the wrong consciousness, doubt comes in, right? In other words, because you start to challenge your own wrong consciousness. That's Dharma practice, right? So if you're thinking this person is evil, right? And then you start to recognize, so, evil, right? I mean, maybe we don't use that term. That's not the language we use, but when we're angry, we exaggerate the negative of a person. That'd be a wrong consciousness, right? It's an exaggeration. So it as the definition goes here, it engages the object erroneously, right? It's exaggerating their negative qualities, right? So you see what I'm getting at there? So that's a wrong consciousness. Then when you recognize you're having a wrong consciousness, that recognition is a correct consciousness, but it doesn't get rid of the wrong consciousness, does it? In practice, right? And so this is what these 7 ways of knowing are getting at in terms of real Dharma practice as it's lived and experienced, is that then as you start to challenge your own wrong consciousness, you have doubt, right? And at first, oftentimes, so there are 3 types of doubt. Now I'm going backwards to page 22. So now we can get to doubt. Okay, now I'll look over doubt. Because I think it's most useful to look at wrong consciousness first. So what's doubting? This is where we're actually up to. It's at the bottom of page 22. Doubting consciousness. And doubting consciousness is extremely important for practice, is what I'm getting at, right? So in our own system, anyway, the definition of doubting consciousness is a knower that has qualms too pointedly by its own power. So it's a mind that is, through its own power, having 2 different contradictory assessments of the object. And then it says here, a mind that possesses similarity with doubt and the feelings, etc., which are accompaniers of that mind, possess similarity with doubt, have qualms by the power of doubt, but do not have qualms too pointed by their own power. What that's getting at, just to be clear, in the commentary, it said this, is that when they say a knower that has qualms, they're saying it's the main mind, right? It's your consciousness. And what they're getting at here with feelings, et cetera, are there, we'll cover these actually in mind and mental factors, which we're going to start in, I guess, June. But they're giving an example of the 5 omnipresent mental factors. So feeling, intention, attention, contact, and discernment. Those accompany any given moment of mind. And so what they're getting at is that those are also connected to doubt and are of a similarity with doubt. But doubt is, when you say a doubting consciousness, you're talking about the main mind, right? So your actual consciousness is having doubt. It's accompanied by feelings, and so on, and discernment. So when you're doubting about something, you're discerning what you're doubting about, right? You're discerning the object, and then you're having doubts about it, and so on. So that's all that's saying. But then it says here, this is the important part, I think, for us. It says, when doubting consciousness are divided, there are 3. Doubt tending towards the factual, doubt tending towards the non-factual, and equal doubt. So I think this is really important, because I'm going back. Right, so I'm using a more mundane example than emptiness, right? So if we're angry at somebody, right, and we're thinking and we feel like they're all bad, we're viewing them as terrible, right? So if we're going to work with that, first we have to have a moment of a correct consciousness that recognizes we're having a mental affliction. If you don't have that, then you just think, you just stay in hatred. But if you recognize you're having a mental affliction, right, then you start to challenge it, right? So you might think, well, wait a second, like sometimes they're kind. Also, they have Buddha nature, right? All beings have Buddha nature, but whatever, you might apply different reasons, right? And actually, if you check though, right, it's interesting, isn't it? Like, depending on how mad you are, first of all, you might just think, I don't care, right? But if you really work with it, eventually you may get to doubt tending towards the non-factual. That's where, like, you're still mostly feeling and thinking they're bad, they're a jerk, right? But you're starting to go, well, I might be exaggerating. And that's a really interesting moment, isn't it? Like, where you're in a mental affliction, but you're starting to genuinely have a recognition, I might be exaggerating right now, right? And that's doubt tending towards the non-factual. Right? You're actually doubting your own perception, right? And that's hard, right? Like, to get even to that, right? And eventually you want to get towards equal doubt then, right? Where you're going, and equal doubt is like where you're of 2 minds about something, but you actually recognize you don't know, right? You're like, I don't really know what's going on. I'm not sure which is correct, right? So you have 2 minds. Maybe it's this, maybe it's that, but I don't know actually. And then there's doubt tending towards the factual, which is doubt leaning in the correct direction, And I just want to, right, like, this happens. I just want to really emphasize this. Like, this is what happens in real Dharma practice, right? It's the same thing, right? If you're exaggerating the positive qualities of something, which is desire, right, craving, right? Like, you're really caught up in perceiving that thing as attractive, right? Like, you're actually seeing it that way, which is a wrong consciousness, right? Like, if you're exaggerating. And it's hard, right, to actually apply. We don't actually, because, the mental affliction resists, right? And so, like they talk about, one of the antidotes, right, to exaggerated craving is seeing the faults of the object that you're craving, right? That's hard to apply, isn't it? And even to get to a point of doubt is a challenge if you're caught up in a mental affliction, whether it's anger, whether it's craving, whether it's whatever, any mental affliction. So this is I just want to point out, so this process is actually how Dharma practice works. And then, the ultimate example of that is emptiness, but the same thing applies to emptiness, right? And, we talk about, when we teach on our study or, meditation on emptiness, there's that whole teaching on identifying correctly the object of negation, right? That is actually recognizing our wrong consciousness, right? Understanding that we're having a wrong consciousness, and specifically identifying what is that wrong consciousness, right? And then what we're trying to do when we contemplate, right? Is it one with the object? Is it other than the object? We're trying to, or is it dependent arising, or is it, is it risen from self, or risen from other, or risen from both, or risen from neither? All these reasonings, right, to understand emptiness. What we're trying to actually do initially is just get ourselves to doubt our own wrong consciousness, right? And if we doubt it enough, eventually we'll get to doubt tending towards the factual, right? And if we do that enough, eventually we can get to more and more moments of correctly assuming consciousness, right? Which is like where you have some level of conviction that there's, in this example, that things are empty, right? And that comes, and then if you keep going, eventually you gain a inferential valid cognition of emptiness, which is humongous achievement, right? And so spiritually, and so on. So my point is, you get the point, like in any of these examples of Dharma practice, you're working with these different ways of knowing. These are how we work with our mind. And so one point I want to make is that's one reason why it's useful. Another point that I said last class, but I want to emphasize again, is another usefulness of these is, like, sometimes it's hard to know, like, how am I doing in my spiritual practice, right? I sometimes joke, like, like, I don't know, in school or something like that, like, it was quite easy, wasn't it? Like, as you get a grade, you got an A or a B or a C or something, and then you know how you're doing, right? Or you take a test and you get a grade. Nobody grades you in Dharma practice, right? Like, and actually, it's funny. And even if you do get a grade, one time I remember this. Like, I had I'll just share. This is a funny point, but I remember, like, when I was in college, and I was studying with a lama, a geshe, and he was like being very nice to me and praising me a lot. And then I remember one day he was teaching, and he was teaching an actual text, and it said, when you have very immature, like not very good students, praise them and give them gifts, because they're so immature that otherwise they won't engage in practice at all. And then he said, when you have a better student, you don't need to do that. You can actually point out their faults. And so I was like, oh, he gave me some little gifts, and he was always being nice. I realized, oh, he was just doing that because I'm such a bad student, actually, that, I wouldn't practice at all unless he was kind of like, oh, that's great. You said one Om Mani Padme Hum. Oh, congratulations, kind of like that. And then eventually he stopped, praising me and giving me presents. And I thought, oh, phew, okay, at least I was like, that's actually a sign of some progress. So there's no grading system, is my point, right? Like in your Dharma practice, the grading system is internal, right? And so if you know these 7 ways of knowing, then you can know how you're doing, right? You can say, where am I at in my understanding of emptiness, right? Like, and you can know for yourself. Am I most of the time, am I completely in wrong consciousness? Do I have some doubt? Where's my doubt at? And you can assess yourself, right? In the Lojong teachings, it says that. It says, there are 2 witnesses, but the main one is yourself, right? It says there are 2 witnesses, other people's feedback and your own observation of your mind. Those are the 2 ways you can get feedback, right? To assess your practice. And then there it says the main one is your own assessment, right? How are you doing? Because you can pretend you're being patient while not really being patient, right? So other people can't know for sure, but if you're honest with yourself. But how do you know it? Through this, right? Through these 7 ways. If you say, where am I at in my understanding of emptiness? well, do I have a correctly assuming consciousness, or do I have a doubt that's neutral, and so on, right? When I get caught up in craving, how quickly am I able to actually shift from a wrong consciousness, and where do I shift to? Do I actually get to a valid cognition, or am I just getting to equal doubt or something? So my point is, these understanding these ways of knowing is a way of actually checking how am I doing. And then actually it's not hard, right? What the Dharma teachings are and how you move through these, right? So am I applying, then you can actually see, well, am I just not applying the methods, right? Like, and if you're honest, there may be some areas where you do and some areas where you're not, right? Where you go, well, I'm so caught up in this particular mental affliction that I don't actually apply any antidote to it, right? Because what does it say in the 8 verses of Mind Train, right? As soon as a mental affliction arises, I will apply an antidote, right? So we can say that in the 8 verses of Mind Training for Lojong. But with these 7 ways of knowing, you can actually check, well, am I doing that? And if you start to check, you might go, well, with this mental affliction I do, with that one I don't actually. I just stay in the mental affliction, right? And therefore I stay in wrong consciousness. And one last thing I want to say on this general point is, because actually, as Shanti Deva and many other Buddhist teachers say, it's whatever we're familiar with is what we do, right? Like, so in other words, somebody who's familiar with bodhicitta, it's easy to cultivate bodhicitta, right? But somebody who's familiar with craving, it's easy to cultivate craving. Right? And my point is that if it's hard to move from a wrong consciousness to say, a valid inferential cognizer, it's because we're not familiar with that, right? That we're familiar with the wrong consciousness, because our mind goes to whatever we're familiar with. So anyway, so these, I think through these methods, it's quite easy then, right? You can go, if I easily give rise to very strong wrong consciousnesses about certain topics, well, then it's quite clear, isn't it? For myself, how's my Dharma practice doing? Well, in that area, I'm not practicing, actually. I'm just familiarizing with wrong consciousness. And it's good to know that, right? So then, and at least when we know that, then we can say, oh, I just had a correct consciousness. My correct consciousness is that I'm familiarizing myself with wrong consciousnesses. And that's a good thing to know, because then we can apply an antidote if we want to, or at least we could be honest with ourselves about where we're at. So these 7 ways of knowing are an amazing gift, like I think. Okay, so going back to doubting. See, I just want to say, I want to explain all that because, again, like if you just read doubting consciousness, it could seem like you're reading about something like, I don't know, like reading a classification of birds in the Galapagos, or I don't know, like as if it's something distant from yourself. If you're not in the Galapagos right now, I don't know, or on Zoom, so people could be. But my point is that these are not like a description of some far off phenomena. These are, actually, like I was thinking about, actually, I'll just give one more example. I was thinking about this the other day. Like, I was thinking because Shayla's been having a health issue, so she was like looking on Googling, and I was like, oh, I work as a psychologist. Every week I hear somebody comes to therapy and they've been Googling something, right? Like about and they'll say, oh, I think this is going on. And my point is like, so what's that, right? Are they having a wrong consciousness? Are they having a doubting My point is like, it's, these are not far. I mean, it applies to our ignorance. It applies to our mental afflictions, but it applies to like, whether it's about a health issue, right? People Google that, or whether it's misinformation, on the internet or things like that, right? How do people move from, and do you see, like, one thing I'll share is as we've been going through this material and I've been more aware of it, I started to go like, wow, it's so helpful to like, just to know I don't know. Like I started to notice how often I correctly can stay in, like somebody will say something, I'll be like, oh, I don't know the answer to that, right? Because I don't have a valid inferential cognition about it. And how we want to like think we know something, and it's a mistake we all make, I think, or ordinary people make, is like assuming we know things we don't know, right? And which is wrong consciousness, right? Whereas if you say, oh, I don't know about that, right? Like that's, in other words, knowing you don't know something is not a wrong consciousness, right? But because a wrong consciousness engages erroneously, engages its object erroneously, right? So in other words, it thinks it knows something, but what it believes it knows is actually erroneous, right? So I'm just pointing, I guess all I'm really saying is these 7 ways of knowing are amazingly useful for Dharma practice, but they also apply to all other areas of life, right? Like, if so they apply to, our views on everything from, health issues to social issues to political issues and so on, right? Like, and so these are a tool to actually challenge ourselves, if that makes sense. So if you think you know something, to ask yourself, well, have I had an incontrovertible inferential cognition of that or not, right? Have I had a direct perception of it that's incontrovertible, or an inferential cognition of it that's incontrovertible? And if not, then I don't know it for sure, right? And maybe I have and then it's quite challenging, as I was pointing out last time. How can, in real life, I've already taught one of these, but how do you differentiate between a correctly assumed, because if you have I want to point out something. If you've had a valid cognition that's inferential, then you know something, right? But if you haven't, how do you differentiate between whether you're having a wrong consciousness or a correctly assuming consciousness, right? So sometimes we're correctly assuming something that's correct, but we don't know it incontrovertibly yet. So how do you know if you're having a wrong consciousness that's wrong about erroneous about how it views things, or if you're having a correctly assuming consciousness? And I just want to point out, in a Buddhist text, that's easy because they'll use a simple example, like if a person, with a correctly assuming conscious, they might use the example of when a person correctly assumes that sound is impermanent, they're having a correctly assuming consciousness, right? Well, in that instance, it's quite easy, isn't it? Because sound is impermanent, and we know that, and Buddhism always uses that example, or many times these texts use that example. In real life, it's much harder, isn't it? To answer that question, because we don't always have the, you don't always have the answer key. But anyway, that's where we use our Dharma, right? And so this is our practice. Lynn has a question or comment.
I have 2 questions. I found this study is really helpful experientially. I don't know that I think consciously I need to do this, or I should do this, or this is a better way of being in the world. But it does help get me there. So, but I don't know, how do I say this? I mean, I had an example in my real life, my life outside this class. Okay, so, I'm very adversarial, and we represent plaintiffs who have been wronged somehow. So there's this whistleblower case. So the lawyer on the other side is not so bright, but very obstructive, right? And so we got into, oh, she's so stupid. Oh, she's so, she lies all the time. And there's another friend of mine who's got a case against her. And I said, get everything in writing because she lies. And he called me up and said, yeah, you're right. She lies, right? But don't tell her that I told you that. So anyway, so we end up taking these depositions, which are testimony under oath. And most of them are by Zoom, but we have 2 in person. So we all had to go to Detroit Thursday for a deposition yesterday. So she calls up Thursday night and says, oh, the witness was exposed to COVID. What do you want to do? And we're already out in Detroit. We don't want to, we didn't want to travel to begin with. So now we have all day in a conference room with a witness who's not going to be there, right? And we doubt she's telling the truth, right? So as it ends up, we're in the conference room with her. The witness is remote. The court reporter is remote. Everything is okay. It's not ideal, but we didn't need to go to Detroit, right? So we're sitting in this conference room, and she really wants to be our friend. I have an associate lawyer, and she's borne the brunt of this. She's a younger lawyer and very, very, very good, and is outraged that this counsel lies all the time. So we spend the whole day in the conference room with an incompetent court reporter, a witness that's lying. He's her witness. So anyway, so we get to the end of the day. We're all on the same flight together. So we go to the airport. So we have dinner together. She's like forcing us to have dinner together. She pays for the Uber. We get to the airport. We're having dinner. And she tells us her life story. And it's through the dinner, I was like feeling bad about thinking she was such an evil person, right? And then I said, go with it. Okay. So the doubts is seeping in. Like, is your view of this person correct? And, you know, she tells me about her life and this, and our co-counsel. And so after the dinner, I'm thinking, I'm in a really bad place because now I like her. She's not a terrible person. She does terrible things, but I don't dislike her. And by the way, what the hell is she doing anyway? I think she wants to settle the case. So anyway, it's very expensive, very acrimonious case. So we go through that. Then we wait at the gate. She's really helpful to my associate who didn't get a seat on the plane. The plane's full, you know, the whole thing. So the plane leaves at 10:15, and I get on the flight and I think, why am I feeling this way? She's obviously the other side. She obviously has a strategy. But my letting go of this false consciousness, or this consciousness that she's a bad person, has really allowed me to see what's going on in a way. And so it's like the doubt led to this feeling of uneasiness, what's going on here? And then it led to what I think is a correct perception of what's going on. But it was an all-day process. It took like, 12, 14, 16 hours. But I attribute that to this practice because I don't think I would have let down my guard enough to have that experience. That's where I got with it in the end. Mm. So it's sort of like, I thought this morning when you started talking about this, you know, it's the universe brings you experiences that lets you put the teachings into practice. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Totally.
And it was definitely a journey. It's like she gets lunch and is nice about lunch. What do we want for lunch? I was like, oh, don't trust this person. And then it gets to the Uber, right? And then it gets to the airport dinner. And then it, you know, it gets to the waiting for the plane to, you know, board. But it was like a long process. And I keep feeling this doubt, like maybe she's not as bad a person as I think she is, you know. But it's very clarifying because in my mind, it helped me realize who she is and what she's doing. So yeah. So I don't know what to say, but it's sort of experientially, the teachings help me experience and get to this place of doubt and then more certainty. I don't know. It's a long example. I didn't mean to take all this time, but.
I think it's a great example because that's how real life is, isn't it? It's like it often does take time and it takes effort and openness to, right? Because, you know, you could challenge it internally, but often as with other people, you have to then let yourself have an experience with them to challenge your own, right? To work through something. And then I think I did one other observation, and I think when we do that, it becomes easier the next time, and then the next, if we keep doing that. But it's hard, right? Like, and it does, and it's interesting, and it doesn't mean, you know, if we're staying with valid cognition, right? It doesn't mean there's a few experienced her lying, or, you know, and also some. It doesn't negate that, right? It's like, no, I've had the experience. It leads to a much more accurate, you know, it's like what, yeah, anyway, a more accurate and holistic picture of the person, doesn't it? Like where it's like, yes, you know, in other words, I know she can lie, and also I know she has this in her life story, and I know she wants to be friendly at other times, and I know, and all those things are true. So you're developing a much more accurate picture of her, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's actually, I hate to be so instrumental, but it's good for the case because I know what she's up to now. She wants to settle the case, so it's really interesting that it's, you know, all these things.
Have you ever? I found that to be. I mean, I've noticed the Dalai Lama often says that. He says, like, if you view somebody with just anger or, you know, like that, then you don't, you know, like you oversimplify them, And then you get in the way of finding a solution with that person because you don't actually see them accurately. Whereas if you have a difference, if you have a difference with somebody, but he points out, if you have compassion rather than anger, then you can see them accurately, which actually helps come to a better, you can open up to more possibilities of how to get to a solution because you have a more accurate picture. And that's exactly what you're describing.
Right.
Yeah, and that's been my experience too. Like with, when I oversimplify somebody, right, which is a wrong consciousness, then it's very hard to come up with any solution because they're just bad and there's no, then that's that. And whereas when you get to know them, you start to go, oh, wow, okay, yes, they do this thing that's not helpful, but they're a whole person, and what are the ways in and what are the ways to work with them, and all that.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, so I think that's a great example of what we're talking about in real life. Yeah, that's what I was getting at too. I mean, with emptiness or with sound is impermanent is quite easy in a way. I mean, it's not easy, but it's easy, at least intellectually. Whereas, with that kind of example, it's much more, I don't know, you don't have the answer beforehand, I guess is what I'm getting.
Right.
It's not like you can't just look up the answer in a book. You have to actually
experience it, sort of.
Yeah, interpersonally. And yeah. Which is exciting though, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it was sort of exciting. I was exhausted, but I thought, okay, I know what's going on now.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's one of the effects of Dharma. Like that, I guess that to me, that's like part of Dharma practice in real life, right? Where we don't, where we do that's the hard work of actually practicing in the interpersonal context with other people, and really working to not believe our own wrong consciousnesses, because we all have them, but to open up to doubt and then to eventually a more accurate. Yeah. It's amazing. Sujata. Yeah.
Your question was really helpful, and thank you. To me, I've been struggling with a really bizarre opportunity. I just had to watch someone in person interview Elon Musk, and I was deeply, deeply, deeply disturbed by some of the horrible things coming out of his mouth, and I was noticing my aversion arising. And at the end, the person interviewing was humanizing Elon by showing pictures of him holding his child and talking about his Asperger's. And I was noticing that I was so just completely torn up inside about, this is what I believe in. I believe in humanizing all people, including people who do the worst harms. But then I was seeing this audience of people that he was trying to influence to help him buy back Twitter. So like Trump can get his account back, I'm like, what is happening? And I'm watching and I'm like noticing this intense, like a feeling of the lack of wisdom of humanizing someone. And then thinking, but I know that humanizing everyone is actually good because he is a human. Like it was just so torn up. And I don't know, this conversation was extremely helpful in me realizing actually reducing my anger doesn't mean that I try to help stop someone from doing harm. I can do that from a place of compassion. I might actually have more wisdom about how that might be done. Not that I have any capacity personally to stop Elon Musk from doing anything, but just in general, what I was noticing was that getting I was so lost in my own tortured, doubting mind about my own knowledge, like doubting my own fundamental belief that we need to humanize even people who do most unthinkable harms, was called into question. It was just a very interesting, anyway, this was very helpful to me to, at least now I can sit here and go, right, if my mind is clear, if I have some versions of more valid cognition, I can be more beneficial instead of just being lost in a cloud of my own. You could see someone as human and still think, well, they really ought not lie and do this incredible harm to my client. And like you can think both of those things at the same time, right? If anything, you could think it out of a place of loving kindness and compassion for the person causing harm. So anyway, this was really helpful. for me on that front. And then I'm sorry to have missed last week and also have joined late today. And I'm missing some of the 7. Lauren, if you could just repeat them in order, I guess starting from wrong consciousness, I guess the 7th would probably be direct valid cognition. Just to list those out, that would be really helpful for me to figure out what this progression is that I'm supposed to be going in.
Sure. Yeah. So when they list them as the 7 ways of knowing, which is not really, they're all included in this text, but they're not listed in order together in one group in this text. And the, certain ones are of the 7. I'll say this: if you're thinking of them as a progression, 5 of them are, like, for example, in understanding emptiness, for example, 5 would be a progression and 2 don't necessarily fit into a progression. So but if we're starting with wrong consciousness, so you start with wrong consciousness, and there are different ways of listing them and with different orders, but I'll list them in the order that I'm using. So wrong consciousness. The second one would be awareness to which an object appears but is not ascertained. And that's not one of the, if you're doing a sequence, that's not one of the sequence, because that would just be any example where, the example, right, we've given the example of that, like that would be like, if you're really caught up in a conversation and somebody passes by and you don't ascertain who they are. But that would be the second of 7. The next one we just covered is doubting consciousness, and that would be among the 5 that are sequenced. Then correctly assuming consciousness, which would be, obviously in progression. Next one, which would not be part of a progression, but is subsequent cognizers. Anyway, we covered what those are. We can talk more about it if you want, but subsequent cognizers. And then the last 2 would be the 2 prominents. So inferential valid cognizers and direct valid cognizers. Yeah, and so with understanding emptiness, right, you would go from wrong consciousness to doubting consciousness to correctly assuming consciousness to an inferential valid cognition to eventually a direct valid cognizer. In this case, it would be a direct yogic valid cognizer, of course. But so that would be, yeah.
Thanks, that was really helpful. And the 2 that don't seem to fit into like necessarily a progression would be awareness to which the object appears but is not ascertained, and subsequent cognizers are just other consciousnesses, but not necessarily, I couldn't figure out where they fit in an order, but they don't fit in an order. Thank you, that's great.
No, that's exactly right. Yep. Okay. So you get the idea of doubting consciousness, and as I said last time, with regard, I'll just mention this again because I think it's an important point spiritually, is that there's that I've often quoted it. There's that famous line from Nagarjuna's foremost student is Aryadeva. There's a famous line from Aryadeva which says, he's teaching in his 400 stanzas on emptiness, right? He says, I'm not going to get the exact wording right, but he basically says, with regards to this matter, meaning emptiness, when one generates doubt, one tears samsara to shreds. Essentially the meaning of what he says. And when they give commentary on that, what they're saying is that means when one gives, the commentary says that's doubt leaning towards the factual, tending towards. So in other words, with regards to the understanding of emptiness, when one gets to the level of doubt tending towards the factual, that tears samsara to shreds, is what Aryadeva is saying. And that's often mentioned in the context of teaching on doubting consciousness, because and part of the point here is that, like, with regards to emptiness, if you can get to the point of doubt tending towards the factual, that Aryadeva is saying, that's quite an important spiritual accomplishment. If you can actually get to that level, right, of awareness, which is still quite far from, a valid cognizer, but it's tending towards a valid cognizer, right? I think one way I think of that, I remember, I remember when I was young, the first time I went cross country, and we're getting to the what do you call it, the continental divide, right, where it's like you're in the middle of the country somewhere, and then you realize, like, oh, whatever water is here is eventually going to end up in the Pacific, and whatever water is on this side of it is eventually going to end up in the Atlantic. So I think doubt leaning towards the factual is like a continental divide on the journey of understanding emptiness. That's, I think, what I'm using my own metaphor now, but it's like if you're journeying towards understanding emptiness, like, when you get to that point, you're still quite far from the other coast. But, but the water is going to eventually get there. That's, I think, what Arya Deva was hinting at, right? Is like you've reached a kind of, if you keep going, as long now if you stop there and you move in, you'll never get to the other coast. But if you're on a journey and you get there, right, it'll let you get there. So if you're water and you keep going, so don't let yourself then sit in some sealed pot. That won't work. But if you keep journeying, like if you're the water and you get to the continental divide, as long as you keep flowing, you'll eventually get to the other shore, the other coast or something. So anyway, doubt turning toward the factual is important with regards to understanding emptiness. Okay, so now we'll return to wrong consciousness, where we've been since beginning of time. It's fun, but okay, not all the time, but with regards to self-grasping, all the time, actually. Now let's go over that. So wrong consciousness is defined as a knower that engages its object erroneously. And then in divisions, there are conceptual wrong consciousnesses and non-conceptual wrong consciousnesses. An example of a conceptual wrong consciousness that Perpetual gives here is the thought apprehending sound as permanent and the thought apprehending the horns of a rabbit. And again, I just want to point out, right, it's like, so one point I want to make is, if you notice, actually, it doesn't say this, but the two examples he gives, one is apprehending sound, which is inexistent, in an erroneous way, believing it to be conceptually viewing it as permanent. The other, horns of a rabbit, rabbit doesn't have horns at all, right? So it's superimposing something that's totally non-existent. So there are different there are different versions of conceptual wrong consciousnesses. And again, I just want to emphasize this point, right? That he gives two traditional Buddhist examples that are good to think about, but then we need to apply them to our own lived lives, as you all are doing, right? So, whether it's, then you apply that to, as you guys, to examples were given, to a coworker, to your friend, to your whatever, like to the real, and so, and again, I can't emphasize this enough, right? That recognizing your own wrong consciousness is foundational for Buddhist practice, right? If we're not doing that, we're not practicing effectively. So, okay, so that's and again, conceptual wrong consciousnesses are quite important. Then, with regard to the second, non-conceptual wrong consciousnesses, there are two: mental consciousnesses that are conceptual, non-conceptual wrong consciousnesses, and sense consciousnesses that are non-conceptual wrong consciousnesses. Then it says the first, a mental non-conceptual wrong consciousness is, for example, a dream consciousness that clearly sees blue as the blue of a dream. And then it says the subject is a mental consciousness, a non-conceptual consciousness, and a wrong consciousness. And then he's going to show why, right? So he says it's a mental consciousness because it's a dream consciousness, right? So that means it's, and what's that getting at? When we're in a dream, our sense consciousnesses have temporarily stopped functioning, right? So he's saying it's a mental consciousness because it's a dream consciousness, so it's not a sense consciousness, right? Then he says it's a non-conceptual consciousness because of being a consciousness that is free from being a determinative knower, which apprehends a sound generality and a meaning generality is suitable to be mixed, which is the definition of a conceptual, right? Conceptual consciousnesses, by definition, are consciousnesses that apprehend sound generalities and meaning generalities suitably mixed. But he's saying a dream consciousness apprehending blue is not like that. And the last is it's a wrong consciousness because of being a consciousness that apprehends its object, a form which is a phenomena source, as blue, where it does not exist as blue. Right. So he's saying, so a dream consciousness that perceives, in this example, blue, would be it's a mental consciousness that's a non-conceptual wrong consciousness. I just want to raise a very small point just from one of the commentaries I read. If the person were lucid dreaming, right? So in other words, if the person were in a dream and knew they were dreaming, which happens, right, sometimes, right? Lucid dreams are well documented in Buddhism and also in science and so on. So if somebody said, oh, I'm dreaming of blue, that wouldn't be a wrong consciousness, right? It would be correct because what is dreaming of blue? The reason why it's a wrong consciousness is that in the dream, one believes, if one's not having a lucid dream, right, then one is in that moment believing that blue is there, but there's no blue there, right? It's a dream consciousness, but one is not taking it to be a dream consciousness. One thinks one's seeing it with one's eyes, right? One is experiencing it as if it's a vision, as if it actually exists as an external object, whereas it's just a dream object. So that makes it a wrong consciousness. So that's an example of a mental wrong consciousness. Then he says, however, we say that for a person, this is an interesting point. He says things like this over and over again. He says, however, we say that for the person who is dreaming, that dream consciousness that clearly sees the blue of a dream as blue is a factually concordant sense consciousness. And so I just think this is an interesting point that he gets at, which is from the perspective of the person in the dream, right? While they're in the dream, it's, and they see blue, we say it's factually concordant. In other words, from their perspective, while they're in the dream, it's factually concordant in the sense that, when they dreamed they saw blue, they dreamt they saw blue, right? And in the dream, they're experiencing it a certain way. It's not actually that way, because it's a dream, right? So when they wake up, they'll realize, oh, there was no blue house. It was just a dream. Let's say, I'm just making an example, right? The person dreams of a blue house, then they wake up and realize there's no blue house. So what he's getting, and they often do this in Buddhist texts, don't they? Where they point out from whose perspective, right? And so they're saying from the perspective of the dreamer while they're in the dream, when he says here, we say it's factually concordant, but it's not actually factually concordant, right? And there are a lot of, I'm just pointing this out, that there are a lot of examples like that in Buddhism. Anyway, which I guess I just want to say, part of the reason why I'm pausing there is when we're in a wrong, and what this is getting at in a way is what we were getting at earlier, which is like, I want to go back to Lynn's example, right? In Lynn's example of the person, right, the other lawyer, like, it's strange, isn't it? Like, if a whole group, let's imagine, I think Lynn, you kind of hinted at this. Let's imagine if you're with a group of that, imagine that person's not there, and you're with a whole group of people, and everybody dislikes that person. Right? And if everybody's saying, "Oh, that person's terrible," they're a lying, da 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 da. Excuse me, no, I'm not going to use the language. Like, you could say, from the perspective of that group of people, that person's a lying, horrible person, right? Are they actually a horrible person? That's the question, right? So in other words, what they're getting at is that, like, it's quite tricky, isn't it? Like, in other words, that what it's hinting at is that wrong consciousnesses from the perspective of the person fully grasping at the wrong consciousness is believed to be a correct consciousness. That's what I'm getting at, right? Which is why it's really hard. If that weren't true, Dharma practice would be easy in a way, right? Like, so, and it's the same point they make in the teachings on self-grasping, right? From the perspective of ignorance, the self exists. It doesn't exist, right? But from the perspective of ignorance, from that perspective, it's an existent thing, although it's not an existent thing, right? It's a very subtle point, right? But but it's important in the sense that, if you, again, it's easy to see that if you're talking about somebody else, right? What's hard, like, so in other words, if I look at some group of people and I think, oh, they're all, caught up in some misinformation and they think this is true, but it's not true. So it's easy to say, well, from their perspective, the perspective of that group of people, that's true, although it's not true, right? What's hard to say is to recognize that about oneself, isn't it? In other words, that there are things I fully believe are true that are not true. And that's what this is getting at, right? That's why I think it's an interesting example of a dream, right? You dream of something and you totally believe it's true, right? Every night we do that, right? When we dream, we believe the dream is true, even though it's not true. But we do that all day also, over and over again. And that's what this point is getting at, is that from the perspective of the person who's totally caught up in a wrong consciousness, the wrong consciousness is true, but it's not true. Anyway, you get the point. Then it says, examples of the second, wrong consciousnesses that are sense consciousnesses, are sense consciousnesses that see snow mountains as blue, or sense consciousness that see a white conch as yellow. So there was the example of a wrong consciousness that's a sense consciousness would be a sense consciousness that's, we gave examples of these earlier. It would be sense consciousnesses that see things, what's the definition? That see things erroneously because of some kind of illness or because of some kind of cause of error, right? They're examples of, like, they give examples, right? A cause of error, or they give examples, right? If somebody's enraged and they see things as red, for example, it's because of, there's a cause of error in the sense that the rage is affecting their body and they misperceive things, but that would be a sensory experience. So sometimes, so sensory experiences can also be wrong consciousnesses. Okay, so that ends that section of those kinds of ways of knowing that are related to the 7 ways of knowing. This time. So I'll start in on the next. Then there's another kind of division of knowers. So it says the next is a 3-fold division of awareness and knowers. Then this is a whole different way of, oh, sorry, Rahi, go ahead.
Before we go on, because we're going on to another section, can I go back over something I'm not clear? It's at the bottom of page 20, 21. It's under correctly assuming consciousnesses. And I'm not sure what's the difference between number 1 and number 5. If you look,
correctly assuming consciousness that does not have a reason versus correctly assuming consciousness for which a reason exists but is not settled. Those two.
Yes. What's the difference?
Okay, so like a correctly assuming consciousness that does not have a reason. Let's go here. So they give an example, right? An awareness that apprehends sound to be impermanent in dependence upon the mere word. Sound is impermanent. I guess, okay, so here's the, I'm not going to use their example. I mean, just the difference is this, is actually, if you can almost view those, or you can view those 5 as a progression in a way.
Okay.
And so there is the lowest level, or so number 1 would be like the least advanced in a way, I would say, of the ways of generating a correctly assuming consciousness. And that could be like, oh gosh, I'm going to give an example. Sometimes like, oh, we all can be like this, but there are some people who can very much be like this. Like in Buddhism, they even talk about that. Like there are different types of faculties, but there's some people who, and we all, again, do it at moments, but, where just like somebody says something and you believe it. And so like, and that, an example, that might be like, somebody says, this is true. And you go, oh, wow, cool. That's true. And then somebody else says something else is true. You go, okay, that's true. Like, so sometimes, and that one, sometimes the person is going to be correct, because they happen to come across somebody who says the right thing. And so they don't really apply any reasoning. And from an experiential point of view, the person isn't actually analyzing the statement with reasoning. They just sort of have a kind of a blind trust or a blind faith in what other people say. And so for the first one, it's a correctly assuming consciousness where the person hasn't really applied reasoning at all. It's just like they heard something and they kind of go, oh, great, that seems true. Whereas the 5th one, where it says correctly assuming consciousness for which a reason exists but is not settled, there the person is actually contemplating the reasons. So it actually is applying reasoning. So that's where it says reasoning exists. Or reason exists. The person is contemplating the reasons, but hasn't actually realized something about the reasons. So in that example, so that the person might, be in a process of deeply contemplating the reasons, but hasn't. In the example of sound being impermanent, let's say they haven't fully realized the privation, right? So they have maybe that person has thought about, wow, sound is a product, products are impermanent, but they haven't really. I'm giving an example here. Perhaps they haven't fully realized that all products have to be impermanent. They haven't thought about it enough, so they're not certain of that. So they believe it, and they correctly assume the correct answer, and they're applying reasoning, but they haven't yet. It's like this actually, this one is right before actually gaining a valid inferential cognition, you know, if you keep going. So be somebody who's actually applying the reasoning and could be quite close to having a valid inferential cognition, but hasn't realized some portion of the reason fully. So they've heard the words of the reason, they're contemplating it, but they haven't yet fully ascertained some aspect of the reasoning. So it's not yet an inferential cognition, but they're applying reasoning. So it's two quite different states experientially. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions, I guess, before we go on to the next section? Okay. Oh, Frank.
I wanted to share a little story I'd read about His Holiness. Apparently had a very deep realization of emptiness earlier in his life. And he said that it wasn't really direct realization, but it was actually a correctly assuming consciousness. And which is like, okay, that if he had that powerful realization, and he said, you know, it's not yet an inferential cognition, but so I just thought that was pretty amazing. Thought I'd share that little story.
Yeah, that is amazing. Yeah, it shows that's why, again, I think we can underestimate the power of these states of mind, right? Like, if even the Dalai Lama, as you said, had that, Sonia said that. Yeah. It gives you a better sense of why even doubt leading in the correct direction is quite important, then, isn't it? Like, right. And then this is a first step further than that. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. That's amazing. Anything else before we go on to the next?
Yeah.
Oh,
I would like to say, I've been going through a lot with moving from one place to the other. And many things have become a lot more clear, because it was very hard for me first to accept it, but it happened. And I finally admitted it. And then I have been going through the process before and after. And being in the place right now, yesterday I got, the day before yesterday, I got a text message from my daughter-in-law, and I was just contemplating the day from the day before that I met randomly, all of a sudden, the first real nice spring day that everybody was out, and met so many people, and there was all sorts of communication going on with about 6 persons on that. So I had done a lot that day. I had just put myself out. I just left the house and I forgot about everything I needed to be out, because I hadn't done that for a long time. And then the day after that, I was processing all that. So I became very slow. The day before I was very fast, and this day I was very slow. On the same day, I get this letter, this text from one of my daughters-in-law. And she sent me something without any explanation of how to get awake in the morning, you know. And so she had been talking a long time about that she wanted to change and that she wanted something, and I'd given her some advice, but it seems to be going back and forth, so I never know exactly where I am with her. But I was in a mode to say to her, to text her back and say, oh, this must be great, Susan, but today I am in a slow mode, so I really, you know, I can't say anything about it or something, you know. I didn't see it as anything else. And then it was a text to 3 of us, my son as well, and the granddaughter, so it was like a family thing. And then my son, who is also trying to do his best to keep everything in order, he writes to me and said, that was very hurtful for Susan. And I said, how come? Because I didn't think, you know, I said it's fine for her to be that way, and it's good for me to be that way. I thought that was sort of a neutral approach. And then he said, you don't get it. And it went on a little bit, for quite a little bit, because he really took me through all the steps that he had taken to get this under control, because he lives with this person who has a very difficult background, family background. And there's a lot going on in that family. But he has learned to accept and love her for the way she is. So I said, you don't get it, Mom. She feels offended because she thinks I'm telling her what to do. And she doesn't want to hear that because she hears that all the time. And so finally I said, oh, okay, now I'm getting it. And I have to think about this for a while. So it took me a day and a half to work through that too. And in the end, I thought it's just a way of surrendering. She is like that. Now I have acknowledged it. She hasn't changed, which I didn't know. It's still the same. So the day before that, I had a little statue that she had wanted, because with moving, you want to give some stuff away. And it was a nice lady with a statue, a Victorine, a beautiful, soft person. And she had chosen that from the items that I proposed. So I got finally a box that I could pack it in, where it fitted in and it was safe. And I had packed it all up, and I was going to send it to UPS, and which I did yesterday. And then when I got back, I was sitting at the park, or I was coming back from the Giant, and I had in my head to surrender. And when I finished the shopping, I put the key in the ignition, and it didn't want to start the car. And I have a AAA card, so I phoned them, and they were coming in an hour or so. And so I thought, what am I doing now? I have to open the window with all my shopping in it, and you see what happens. You know, I just surrendered. The sun was out. It was nice weather. I just let it all go. And then there was somebody parking next to me with a mother and a son and a dog. And the mother went out shopping. The son sat in the car, had his window open for the dog. So I had my door open to let some fresh air in my car. And so we started talking. And it appears that we have a lot in common. He just arrived here from Georgia. So, and what his interests are and what he's looking for a job, and a whole story. And we started talking for an hour, and then his mother came back. So after that, the guy arrived, and there was nothing wrong with my ignition, and the battery was good, and he couldn't understand what it was, so I let it go. But I felt so relieved after that. I was so happy that I could just let it go and not get upset about the whole thing. And then last night, for the first time, I could really meditate in peace. And there was sort of a closure to the whole thing. And I just wanted to share that with you, because I think I'm in a good place right now. And also because I've listened, even though I wasn't here, I've listened to all of your teachings, and I have loved it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Wilhelmine. Well, Wilhelmine always does a good job practicing Dharma.
It's so wonderful to have it. It's It makes all the difference.
Why don't I just quick reflection on it, just from what Wilhelmina said, just a very brief one. I think it connects to what Lynn said also. I just want to share this is like, this is just a question I'm going to raise, like just to think about, not to answer. But it's like, because I think both the examples get to this, and many real life examples get it, is when is empathy, right, understanding another person, I mean, the example Wilhelmina gave of her daughter-in-law, when is empathy, actually, you know, what kind of mind, what kind of knower is empathy? I'm just raising it as a question to think about. And when I'll say one point, I'm not going to answer the question entirely, but one is, I think it's very clear, empathy is not always one of these ways of knowing. There are different versions of empathy. Right? There could be an empathy that's a wrong consciousness. There could be an empathy that's a direct perceiver, because our bodies resonate to each other. There's good scientific research showing that, right? Like, you know, there could be an empathy that's a valid inferential cognizer. There could be an empathy that's a correctly assuming consciousness. There could be an empathy that's a doubting consciousness. So, you know, so our understanding of other people also, fits into these ways. It's something we know, right? And we can know it erroneously, we can know it correctly, and there are all different versions of it. And I just think some of these examples are getting at that also, that, so yeah, I think it's something interesting to think about. My empathic understanding of somebody else in any given moment, right? Because it's always in a moment, right? Which way, in what, you know, because it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, and it's quite, you know, actually, if you think of it from your own perspective, when somebody empathizes with you in a completely erroneous way, sometimes that can be, you know, so they think they're empathizing, but they totally misunderstand you. That can be quite difficult, isn't it? And then it's a very different thing when somebody is empathizing with you and they get it right. You know, it's a different kind of experience. And anyway, I just want to point that out, that you know, even empathy is one experience of knowing, of people knowing, of mind, right? But it can be all these different ones. And I think Wilhelmina was getting at, like, more accurate, right? Through the conversation with her son, she got to a more and more accurate empathy with the daughter-in-law. So I just think that was one example of this ways of knowing. Anyway, but we all do that, is my point. And to contemplate even my empathic understanding of somebody else, which way am I knowing that? Am I having a wrong consciousness? Am I having a doubt? Am I having a... Anyway, they're all, any of these consciousnesses could be empathy, but I just think it's an interesting thing that the story got at, in part. It got at other things too, but that was one. More accurate, right? Getting more accurate, our empathy is another example of working on this stuff. And then, all right, so then I'll just at least start. Yeah, we can start this time, start the next. So then there's a threefold division of awareness and knowers. And so the three, with respect to the threefold division of awareness and knowers, there are three parts. An explanation of conceptual consciousnesses that take a meaning generality as their apprehended object. Explanation of non-conceptual, non-mistaken consciousnesses that take a specifically characterized phenomena as their apprehended object. And an explanation of non-conceptual mistaken consciousnesses that take the clear appearance of a non-existent as their apprehended object. And again, I just want to emphasize, like, you know, on the one hand, you could say, well, why is there another division of ways of knowing? But if you look at this one carefully, you'll realize it's a division it's a division that can be useful for practice. That's why. It's not that this is giving some new information that's completely different than the previous information. It's a way of systematizing and looking at ways of knowing that might help us in our practice. And one thing I want to point out is, remember, this is from the perspective of the Sautantrikas, right? This whole class is. And the reason I'm mentioning that is these terms, right? Specifically characterized phenomena. Right? So what is it? Remember from, if you've studied tenets, that specifically characterized phenomena of Sautantrika are impermanent functioning things, right? And those things are things that are they're truly existent. They're actually they're ultimate truths in this school. Specifically characterized phenomena are ultimate truths. They're and they're ultimately true, and they exist from their own side, right? Whereas meaning generalities, and the first one, are the objects of conceptual consciousness, as pointing out, and those don't function from their own side, right? They're not, and so specifically characterized phenomena are impermanent, right, and function from their own side and are ultimately true from their own side. Meaning generalities are static, right? Or you say permanent. I'd say static. I think it's a good. It gets at the feeling of it. But yeah, they're not momentary. They don't function from their own side, right? They function in relation. They're. I mean, they affect us, but they don't in the sense of how we interact with them. But the mind is a specifically characterized phenomena. But the meaning generality is an object of mind that doesn't function from its own side. It's not a functional thing from its own side. So I'm just reminding you that this is in the context of Sautantrika tenets. Right, so conceptual consciousnesses all take a meaning generality as their apprehended object. And then there are two types of non-conceptual, right? Non-conceptual consciousnesses that take specifically characterized phenomena. Those are correct non-conceptual, right? They're valid. I mean, they're valid. And then the other ones are mistaken consciousness that are non-conceptual. And it's interesting, they take the clear appearance of a non-existent as their apprehended object, right? They perceive something that doesn't exist. So now let's look just briefly at the conceptual consciousnesses. They take a meaning generality as their apprehended object. So with respect to the first, there are two, the definition and division. So the definition of a conceptual consciousness is a determinative knower that apprehends a sound generality and a meaning generality as suitable to be mixed. And I wanted to make sure we covered this because I talked about this before a little bit, but I think, this is where we only have like a couple more classes on this before we move on to mind and its functions. And so I want to emphasize a point here is, I just think this is so strange in a way. It's like, if I say to you, what does it mean? If I say, what is conceptual mind? What does it mean to be for something to be conceptuality? You may have your own idea of what that is, right? So are you being conceptual, or are you caught up in your concepts? We have these terms in English, right? And here, actually, it's funny, isn't it? I mean, that's weird, actually. Actually, I'll just share. I mean, I never kind of contemplated this before, but I work as a psychologist. My degree is in psychology, and actually, I don't know. In all my years in psychology and in Western psychology, I never saw a definition of conceptual. Actually, I've never come across one. Not once. Actually, it's sort of assumed that you know what you're talking about when you say conceptual, but without a definition, maybe you don't. Buddhism defines it, right? So this is the definition of conceptual, right? So a conceptual consciousness is a determinative. So determinative knower, right? It means eliminative. It knows by way of elimination, right? And because non-conceptual consciousnesses are not determinative knowers, that you don't use that term, because determinative means like it's determining something by eliminating everything that it's not. And so it's a determinative knower that apprehends a sound generality, right? And we're going to get into what that is, and a meaning generality. And then it says as suitable to be mixed. And why does it say as suitable to be mixed, right? I mean, this is a very precise definition, isn't it? It doesn't say as mixed. It says as suitably mixed. So I'll keep going because it describes why. So, and again, I just think this is fascinating. Have you ever, maybe you have a little because I've mentioned it a little bit before, but this is the detailed part here. Before now, how much have you thought about what does it mean to be conceptual, right? We say, in Buddhism, we even talk about that quite a bit, right? Oh, I want to gain a non-conceptual realization of emptiness. What does that mean, actually, right? In certain practices in Buddhism, we say, decrease your conceptuality, or in Dzogchen, they talk about, right, moving beyond the conceptual mind. But what is a conceptual mind, right? And they even say that. I remember I realized that at one point, it says the Buddha has no conceptual thought. And then for a long time, I was like, what does that mean, no conceptual thought? Well, if you don't know what conceptuality is, how can you know what that, it's impossible to know what that means. So there's all these things about conceptuality in Buddhism So I think I'm emphasizing, why is this useful, right? Why is this helpful? Well, in other words, like from a practice perspective, it's funny, isn't it? If you say, I want to go try to practice Mahamudra and gain a non-conceptual state, but you don't know what conceptual is, well, how will you know if you achieved it, right? Or if you say, I'm practicing Dzogchen, I'm going to go beyond conceptuality. But if you don't know what conceptual is, how will you know, right? And then you say, oh, Buddha is non-conceptual, right? And you say, well, again, if you don't know what conceptual is, how do you know what that even means then? So this is quite interesting, I think, and helpful from Buddhist perspective also. So then it says, we'll keep going. The term sound, of sound and meaning, refers to a sound generality, and meaning refers to a meaning generality. That which apprehends those two as mixed apprehends a collection of those two. There is a purpose for saying suitable to be mixed, because it is necessary to include conceptual consciousnesses in the continuum of a person who is not yet trained in nomenclature. This is because a conceptual consciousness in the continuum of such a person does not apprehend a sound and meaning generalities as mixed, but is merely suitable to be mixed. So what is this getting at? And it's going to get into it more. Oh, actually, I'm going to get into it. I'll introduce it, and it'll say more in the text. But and actually, like, I want to point out, first of all, like, all of this that we're getting at happens instantaneously for us. And we aren't aware of it usually, right? What is it? Sound generality and meaning generality. But what this is getting at, in a way, at one point is a sound generality is a term, right? Language of some kind. And then a meaning generality is the meaning of that sound, right? Or the meaning, is a mental, sometimes we use this term meaning generality, sometimes we translate that as a mental image. Or you could say the meaning, in other words, what does that sound mean, right? A meaning of something. So what this is getting at, one point this is getting at is sometimes, so it's saying suitably mixed in the sense that, so it says a person not trained in nomenclature, right? Sometimes what it's saying is sometimes a conceptual mind can just be a sound. And actually, if we all have that at times, even now. I mean, we're, in the sense that if you hear a new word, you don't know what it means, right? When you're studying a language, right? Sometimes that happens where I'll hear a word and I don't know what that word means, but I know it's suitable. I know it has a meaning, right? So suitable, like, so in other words, it's suitably mixed. Or if I'm reading a book and I come across a term I don't know the meaning, right? I think, what does that mean, right? So I have a sound generality then, right? But not a meaning generality. And when you're a child, there are all kinds of things, right? You hear sounds from your parents or from a teacher, and you don't yet know what they mean, but you go, and so when you say, what does that mean? Or you think, what does that mean? Right? You have a sound generality in the sense of a term or a language, a term, we'll call it, but you don't yet know the meaning. And this is saying, on the other hand, you can also have a meaning, but not yet know the sound, right? In the sense that you can have, like, you can see something and go, what is that? Right? And when you say, what is that? You're looking for the sound, right? You're looking for a word that, or a term or a phrase that corresponds to that, right? Or even you meet somebody, and actually, isn't it funny? One of the first things you do is, oh, hi, I'm so-and-so, right? So you're trying to mix the meaning generality, which is your initial experience of this person, with a sound, right? We do that with each other as human beings. So one point they're getting at, though, so suitably mixed means it can either be a sound or a meaning, or it could be both. And that's what it says next, right? Divisions. It can be a conceptual consciousness apprehending only a sound generality, a conceptual consciousness apprehending only a meaning generality, or a conceptual consciousness that apprehends both a sound and a meaning generality. And then, as is often happens in Buddhism, they use the example now of a vase, right? So they'll say, the illustration of the conceptual consciousness apprehending only a sound generality, would be if somebody said the word, actually, I was thinking of this, like, I don't know how many of you know a little bit, I don't know, I'm not very good, but if I say bumpa, like, what happens? Right? and then now if I say, well, bumpa is the Tibetan word for pot, right? For a vase or a pot, right? And then you start to go, oh, okay, I know what a, right now. So first you have, I mean, if you don't know Tibetan, right, then you would say, first you would have a sound generality, right? Bumpa. And you might say, oh, what's that? Right. And then, and then if I say, oh, that's the same thing as a, and actually it's funny, isn't it? For me personally, if I think of bumpa, I think of a Tibetan vase, but it would apply to a vase made in America, of course, equal. I mean, a Tibetan would use it for either. So what's the meaning generality that you specifically connect to that sound generality can be different. And it's funny, bumpa, because their Tibetans have their own versions of, they have their own style of vases, right? Whereas if I say ki, which means dog, right? Then I don't know. Yeah, I don't specifically think of a Lhasa Apso or a Tibetan dog. I just think of a dog. So, or shimi, cat. So I'm giving examples, right? Like there's not a specifically Tibetan cat that I know of. It's not a cat or a breed of cat. Anyway, my point is that like you get the point here. So there's one way of having conceptuality is just the term, but you don't yet know the meaning, right? Another is where you know the meaning, but you don't yet know the term for that thing, right? And the third is where a conceptual consciousness where you have both a sound and a meaning, right? So in other words, and so just pause there. I just want to think about that for a second. That is what conceptuality is then, right? So conceptuality can be, get the sense of that? It can have those, according to Buddhism, those are the types of conceptuality, right? So there are meanings, there are sounds, there are meanings and sounds. And they give this example, right? When the person, for pot, they say when the person sees a bulbous thing with a flat base, right? But they don't yet know what it's called, right? That would be the example, right? That's often used in these texts. But again, expand it out, right? Like that, you get the point. I want to make sure people get this, right? In Buddhism, they always do this. They use some simple example because it needs to be simple so you can get the concept, right, of what they're talking about. And then you're supposed to go and apply it to the more complex examples of your lived life, right? How do we engage in conceptuality, right? And again, and conceptuality is, in and of itself, is neither good nor bad, right? It can be a good thing, and as we can, when you first gain a conceptual understanding of emptiness, that's quite helpful, right? It can also be a terrible thing, right? Like if you gain hatred, hatred based on religious belief, right, would be an example of horrifying version of conceptuality. So, but they're both can be conceptual, right? Somebody has a certain concept of what it means to be, fill in the blank, right? A Christian or a Muslim or a whatever, or Buddhist or something, right? So, whereas, and so you could, what's the meaning? And you get the point here. What's the meaning that you mix with that sound, right? It could also be different for different people, right? Actually, it is different for each person to some extent, right? It can be slightly different at least. So there's a sound, there's a meaning, and it can be either or both. Then it says, when conceptual consciousness is divided another way, there are two: conceptual consciousness that are fixed names, which are terms, right? And conceptual consciousness that are fixed meanings. What's the meaning of that term? And then again, they use the example of the pot. And then it says, whatever is a conceptual consciousness that affixes a meaning is not necessarily one that affixes a name. For a conceptual consciousness that apprehends its object within thinking this person has a stick is a conceptual consciousness that affixes only a meaning. It is a conceptual consciousness that apprehends its object within affixing an attribute, stick, to the substratum person. I want to explain a little bit what that point is getting at, that paragraph, because I think it can be confusing. So this is getting at kinds of conceptual, how we work conceptually, right? And so what it's saying here is that it's getting at the use of language and how it works conceptually. So it's saying, and so the example of the person with the person has a stick, right? What they're getting at there is it's conceptual, right? But it's not, what they're getting at is if they teach us this is you're not saying the person is a stick, you're saying they have a stick, right? So when you are fixing the label, you're not labeling, so it's using language, right? If you think, oh, that person has a stick, right? You're using language, so you're using terms and meanings, but in this case, you're not affixing, you're not affixing the meaning as a label for the person, you're fixing it to qualify something about that person, right? And so you can use language in that way also, right? We can say like the tall person, the short person, the person with long hair, and so on. But that's not their name, right? And so what they're getting at is there are different ways of using language that are conceptual, some of which are affixing a name to a thing, right? Like so if the substratum were stick, and you said that's a stick, then you're viewing those two as suitably mixed, and you're defining, the meaning applies to the term, right? Stick. The stick is a piece of wood that, and so on, right? That's detached from the tree. That's my definition. But here it's saying sometimes you're affixing a meaning, but that's not affixing a term to that thing, right? So you're saying which person is this? Oh, it's the person with the stick. Oh, which person was that? It's the tall person, and so on. Or if there's a group of people, you say, oh, it's the person with the long hair, right? There, you're using language and you're affixing a meaning, but you're not labeling that person. It's not like that person is now going to be known as the person with the stick. Does that make sense? So, but that's still conceptual because there you're affixing a meaning, and so it could be a meaning. And what this is getting at is there are different versions of. It could be a meaning generality, it could be a sound generality, or it could be both. This is another version of affixing a meaning generality to the substratum person. So it's getting at how conceptuality works here, right? Then it says, this is the other important part. We'll finish, we'll finish this section. So then I'm going to jump to this. It says, when conceptual consciousnesses are divided in another way, this is an important point. There are two: factually concordant conceptual consciousnesses and factually discordant conceptual consciousnesses. The definition of a factually concordant conceptual consciousness is a factually concordant determinative knower that apprehends a sound generality and a meaning generality as suitably mixed. If something is an established base, the conceptual consciousness apprehending it is necessarily a factually concordant conceptual consciousness. The definition of a factually discordant conceptual consciousness is a factually discordant determinative knower that apprehends a sound generality and a meaning generality as suitably mixed. If something is not an established base, the conceptual consciousness apprehending it is necessarily factually discordant conceptual consciousness. And so, I just want to, let's talk about this one just for a few minutes before we stop. So why is that an important distinction, right? Well, you get it. And there's so much of what we've been talking about throughout this entire series of classes is that, right? And so much of our Dharma practice is that, isn't it? Because actually, our just direct perceivers that are wrong consciousnesses, well, those are not primarily for us an issue of Dharma practice, are they? I mean, they can be, but if you have an eye disorder and you're seeing things the wrong color, well, for the most part, you go to a doctor. That's not something you address through your Dharma practice, right? If your ears aren't working properly and you're mishearing things, you go to an audiologist or an ENT. You don't mainly practice Dharma, right? The main area for Dharma practice is that we need to address our factually discordant conceptual consciousnesses, right? And so what this is getting at here is a factually discordant determinative knower, right, that has a sound generality and a meaning generality, where it says if something is not an established base, that means it doesn't exist, right? So in other words, that means we're having a conceptual consciousness that's perceiving a non-existent, as we've talked about before, like what's the most important version of a factually discordant conceptual consciousness from a Buddhist practice perspective? The mind that apprehends self, right? So in other words, when you, and that one pervades all of our days and nights, right? So when you, what's the word? When you have a determinative knower that apprehends a sound generality, and right. So what's the sound? Actually, I want to ask you this: what's the sound generality and what's the meaning generality of connected to self-grasping? It could be different, right? Sometimes it could be I, sometimes it could be me, sometimes it could be your name, right? Actually, so think about that, right? So there's and actually this is quite subtle, isn't it? I just want to point that out, like, just think about that for a moment, because this is getting at the object of negation. So let's just think about it together for a moment. Right? So if you think I, right, Buddhism is not saying you don't exist, right? We know that, right? Buddhism is not saying you don't exist, you do exist, right? So what's the factually discordant determinative knower? What's the meaning generality that you sometimes, or that you often combine with, or always combine with that sound generality? That's a non-existent. That's not an established base. And my point, you think about it, right? The different Buddhist tenet systems suggest different meaning generalities for that, right? It could be, you know, what, so, and actually the meaning, right? So it is I, right? Is the meaning generality that you ascribe, that you, and this is not, it's not in, I mean, it's an intellectual question, but it's an experiential question. Is it a self-existent I? Is it a self-sufficient, substantially existent I? Is it a permanent, unitary, independent I? Right? Those are meaning general. I just want to point out, those are meaning generalities, right? The sound generality is I, right? And then in a Madhyamaka perspective for a second, is it the merely labeled I that goes about your day? And you see where we're getting it now. Why is this important? These conceptual, right? And from a Madhyamaka perspective, the merely labeled I that goes about your day is an established base. But from a Madhyamaka perspective, the independent, or from a Madhyamaka, yeah, we could say the from a Prasangika perspective, the self-sufficient, or even just say the I that exists from its own side, is not an established base. Right? So what this is getting at is, it's actually subtle. Then you start to ask, what's a factually concordant and what's a factually discordant conceptual consciousness? That's our Dharma practice to a large extent, right? I'm using an example of emptiness. Right. But both use language and meaning generalities, right? Sound generalities and meaning generalities. So they're similar, factually concordant and factually discordant. By the way, why do they call it factually concordant? Because there's one point is that conceptual consciousnesses are not non-mistaken. They're saying factually concordant because it accords with the fact, right? Or so like, but it's not they can't say non-mistaken, because remember, from all Buddhist schools, there's a problem with conceptual consciousness, but particularly in this school's system, I just want to go, they say factually concordant, right? Because it accords with the fact of things, right? But it's not non-mistaken because it's still conceptual consciousnesses in ordinary people mistake the concept for the thing itself, right? So it's an interesting point also. They say factually concordant because it is factually concordant, but it's not non-mistaken. So do you see how subtle this is? I just want to point out that's the subtlety here, right? Conceptual consciousness are not completely non-mistaken because they mistake our concept of a thing for the thing itself. And honestly, like, I think the examples people gave help, right? Whereas this is not something, you could say, oh, this is, you could think of it, let's leave emptiness for a moment and come back to something more mundane, right? And we all, whether you think of, say, Lynn's example of the other lawyer, or Sujata's example related to Elon Musk, or Wilhelmina's example related to her family member, right? Do you see the point? Like, we all do this. We get a concept of somebody and we mistake it for them, right? For the person. That's an example, right? But our concept of them isn't them, right? That's what all those examples were getting at. So that it's never non-mistaken, right? But then, and John would say, I'll just finish this point, then I'll ask John, then let John go. But so it's never non-mistaken. But what Lynn and Sujata and Wilhelmina were getting at in their examples are, can they become not factually concordant, right? If we're factually discordant, can we make our concept factually concordant with the nature of that other person? That we can do, right? So according to this tenet system, our concept will never be completely non-mistaken because it's a concept, it's not a person, right? It's a concept of a person. And I'm using the example now of another person, of our understanding of that, right? But our meaning generality can be correct or it can be factually discordant. Does that make sense? And so this is really an important point, is like, what we want to do is, within the realm of conceptual consciousness, is refute our factually discordant conceptual consciousness, replacing them with factually concordant ones. Right? But they'll never be completely non-mistaken because because the person isn't our concept of them. And now you can see, now you think about why. So a Buddha is non-conceptual, right? Because a Buddha knows things directly as they are and doesn't mistake a meaning generality or a sound generality for the thing itself, right? So a Buddha doesn't do that. So you can see why does a Buddha have is non-conceptual? It makes sense now, right? It's not that Buddhas don't use language, they do, right? But Buddhas don't relate to language as in the way that we do, and they don't relate to language as conceptually, which means they don't relate to language as in terms of being a determinative knower. They apprehend a sound generality and a meaning generality is suitable to be mixed, right? So you see the difference there. Anyway, John had a comment or a question.
I think I have 3 questions now, but I'm also fairly confused, I think. So, so I'll just give you the questions and then you can decide if they're worth answering. Right in that 3rd paragraph before we get to B, if something is an established base, I guess my question is, who's establishing the base and how do we understand it, since none of us are Buddhas? Because that's question 1. The second one is, how could we ever understand whether our understanding is factually concordant or discordant, given where most of us are coming from? I don't understand how I would ever understand when I was one versus the other. And then the last one is just what you were just talking about then, that a Buddha doesn't see things as conceptual, which is why they don't make the mistake that we would make. But you said that was in regards to sound. Does that also appear for sound as well as meaning? Or is it only in regards to sound that they don't do that? So I guess those are my 3 questions that I currently have.
Oh, good question.
Again, I may be lost enough where my questions don't make sense.
No, I think your questions are great. And yeah, I'll start with the first one about the established base. Because remember, according to this tenet system, let's stay with this tenet system, right? So whereas in this tenet system, how do we, what was the term? I was going to say functioning things, or specifically characterized phenomena. I was just using that term. Specifically characterized phenomena, which are functioning things, or you could say impermanent phenomena, exist from their own side. is one point. And I'll give an example, like a tree. A tree, according to this tenet system, trees exist, they're truly existent, and they exist from their own side. So my point is like, we can, according to this tenet system, we can establish that you don't have to be a Buddha to establish what's an established base, because I'll give an example. A direct valid cognizer can determine that, or can know that, not determine, can know that something is an established base. Meaning it's an established base means an existent phenomena. So according to this tenet system, I'm looking out the window, I see a tree. Like if you have a direct perception of a tree, then it's an established base because it's the object of a direct perceiver, which is a valid cognizer. So to answer your first question, we don't have to be a Buddha according to this tenet system to know that something is an established base, which means an existent phenomena, because we can have, for example, one example is because I can have a direct perception of it. And if you can have a direct perception of something, then it's an established base because it's existent. And so we can know that. And then if I have and so then using a conceptual consciousness, the example here, like, so I can say, I can have a concept now. The tree has green leaves. They just came in last week or something, here in Virginia. So that's a conceptual, and I can know, and according to this tenet system, I can know that is a factually concordant conceptual consciousness, because I can verify it by way of direct perception in that example. So in that sense, an established base, you don't have to be a Buddha to know that, to have something be an established base, because direct perception, it can, as an example of something that can know that a thing is an existent and therefore is an established base. Then in your second question, how can we, you said, how can we know if something's factually discordant? Was that your second question? Did I have that right? Oh, you're muted, sorry.
How do we distinguish in our perception whether it's factually discordant or factually concordant?
And according to this one, according to that, like there are various ways. Like actually, yeah, like I'll give some examples, because in other words, again, you don't have to be a Buddha to do that, is one point I would make. And actually, I'm going to give a very mundane example. Just, when was it? I think yesterday I was talking with Tashi, who's Gyume Khenchen Rinpoche's, Geshe Tashi, who's Gyume Khenchen Rinpoche's helper, attendant. And he was telling me about Khenchen Rinpoche had an cataract surgery and corrective surgery on his eyes. And he said, oh, right before the surgery, we were looking across from the office or something, and Rinpoche only couldn't see anything there, just saw like blurry, some blur, And Tashi said, "There's a fence," and Rinpoche said, "I don't see it. I don't see a fence," And then he came out of the surgery and he said he could count the slats just immediately after the surgery. He could count the slats on the fence. So my point is like, Rinpoche could then know, right, that his previous perception of blur was factually discordant by way of direct perception. So I'm just giving a very mundane example, right? That would be he knew that then it's an established base. There's a fence there. I can count the slats on the fence, and I'm directly perceiving the fence. So from this tenet systems, that would be an example of direct perception. Another example would be if somebody had some other kind of perceptual disorder where they saw, jaundice, where you saw like white as yellow, right, is a typical example. And then they got treatment for jaundice. And they came back and looked at the mountain again and said, "Oh my goodness, look at that, it's white," right? So then they would know that my previous perception of that mountain as yellow was factually discordant. And they would know that by way of direct perception, is one example. Another example of knowing factually discordant, though, would be in this tenet system would be what we've gotten at, which is inferential cognition. So according to this tenet system, sometimes we can have a factually discordant conceptual consciousness, and then we can apply logic and reasoning and realize that we had a factually discordant. And according to this tenet system, that's part of Dharma practice, right? So like Dignaga and Dharmakirti, for example, suggest that's a good way to practice. So, and I'll give an example of that one. Yeah, oh, and then we'll stop. But an example of the factually discordant one would be, and it's from this book, actually, this text, is a person who previously thought, I mean, this is a typical Buddhist example for a second, but let's say the person thought sound is permanent, right? And then they realized, wait a second, sound is a product. It's always produced, by causes and conditions. Everything that's produced by causes and conditions, there's a pervasion. All things produced by causes and conditions are by definition impermanent. Therefore, sound is impermanent. And they realize that through an inferential cognition. Then they would know for certain, oh, my previous idea that sound is permanent was wrong. I now know that definitively. And that would, and according to this tenet system, that would be an actual knowing of that. So again, so you don't have to be a Buddha to know that something was factually discordant and then, or is factually concordant. You can know it by way of direct perception or inferential cognition. And according to this school, which is an important point, those ways of knowing are incontrovertible. Remember, that's the definition. So that means you really know it. And so that's enough to establish that something is an established base or that it was not an established base. So the idea that, or a more mundane last example is the person who sees, the typical Buddhist example also, right? It's dusk and the person's outside and they see the person steps near a rope and they leap up in the air. They think it's a snake and they become, they run away, and then they get a flashlight and they come back and they shine it and they realize, oh, it was a rope. I thought it was a snake, right? Typical Buddhist example here. But so there, in other words, with the flashlight, their direct perception sees rope, right? And that, well, on the one hand, proves the rope is an established base. And in this tenet system, there's no doubt that's a correct, in other words, it's an incontrovertible knower. And also, according to this tenet system, that person then knows for certain, my previous perception of snake was erroneous. There was no snake, and they can know that definitively. So I guess my point is like, you see, the point here is that in this tenet system, those things are knowable, and prove that something is an established base or is not an established base. Yeah, so go ahead.
So then it's not being done on a conceptual basis, because at least my understanding of the word conceptual is it's not based on physical verification that this is a pencil. Okay, that's also not, I don't have a conceptual nature of the pencil. I have a very physical, valid cognition of direct observation that this is a pencil. I can write with it, and it has all the functionality of what I was taught it was a pencil when I was a child. So it's not conceptual.
It can be either. Actually, according to this tenet system, the validating consciousness can be conceptual. So I'll go back to my example. Like if I see with my eyes a tree, that would be a direct perceiver, right? There's an eye consciousness perceiving trees, so that would be a very clear example of a direct perceiver that's non-conceptual. If I look out the window and see tree, that would be. But in the other example I gave of the person who applies reasoning, right? So if I say, like I thought sound was permanent, then I'm contemplating and I realize, oh, sound is a product, all products are impermanent, therefore sound is impermanent. And then I realize that sound is impermanent. That would be an example of a conceptual valid cognizer that proves that sound is impermanent. So the validating consciousness can be conceptual, and that's my example of it. It would be there was a logical proof that or another one would be, I don't see a fire. The example I gave other times is a traditional Buddhist example. I don't see a fire, but I see billowing. If you're near some neighborhood and you see billowing smoke coming from that neighborhood, and you smell, incredible amount of, you smell the smoke and you hear the fire engines and so on, and you can know, oh, there's a fire over there, but you didn't see fire. You knew it through inferential cognition. So there are ways of knowing in this, in this teaching that would be inferential cognitions that do know. So there's that would be an inferential cognition that knows, my example, sound is impermanent, or there's a fire over there that even though I didn't see fire or hear fire or touch fire. So that you can know conceptually according to this tenet system.
So even though it says conceptual consciousness, it can be either or. It could be both.
Oh, I'm just saying that, I mean, in this example where it's saying, this is talking about conceptual consciousness, but you were asking how is it a valid base or factually concordant? So I was saying either one can prove that something's factually concordant or is a valid base. Is you can prove that by way of direct perception, or you can prove that by way of conceptual consciousness. That's all. Yeah. So, but in that example there, it says conceptual because they're talking about conceptual there. I know we went a little over, so we should probably stop. But what I want to say is, so we'll pick up with this, these points next time. Actually, next time we'll have time. So we're going to pick up with this and talk about it a little more. We'll finish this section. And just so I want to clarify, because some people weren't here earlier. So we're going to, next class, which is this month, I forget what day, but we'll review some of that, and then we're going to cover the next just a couple pages. And then we're going to stop because we're not going to cover, next in this text comes mind and mental factors, but it's a very brief treatment. So we're going to switch gears and jump to the other text, which has already been distributed, but we're going to cover that using Yeshe Gelsen's, this one, Yeshe Gelsen's text, a necklace for those of clear awareness, clearly revealing the modes of minds and mental factors by Yeshe Gelsen. So we'll review this stuff a little bit. So bring any questions you have, is my point next time. We can spend as long as you want on questions about all this, if you have any. We'll cover the rest of just these next couple pages, and then we'll switch gears and cover mind and mental factors, which is, again, still covering the nature of mind, but it's looking at it, it's another way of categorizing mind, which is very useful, because this one, mind and mental factors, gets at like virtuous states of mind and non-virtuous states of mind, and states of mind that are omnipresent, always there, states of mind that are changeable. So some can, which can be virtuous or non-virtuous depending on your motivation and so on. So mind and mental factors is a wonderful topic, but it's a little bit different than this one. So we'll switch gears at that point in terms of texts. John. Yeah.
Sorry, can you just resend the text out again? I just tried searching on it and I couldn't find something with that name in my system.
Yeah, I can resend it to folks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Oh, we should do the, Mr. Jonathan.
Just really quick, is that another Sautantrika text? Is it in the same?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the dedication. So the supreme jewel, bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you, the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. I dedicate all these merits, which are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, so that the I, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, may achieve the Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, and lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, to that state as quickly as possible. Oh, and Varahi just posted, I guess, John, I think she, oh yeah. Oh, Varahi just posted the Google Drive that has all of, so yeah, I won't send them out then. Anybody who needs them, just click on that link to the Google Drive. Thanks, Varahi. That's great. Yeah, so if anybody doesn't have that other text, just click on that Google Drive and you can have it. And right, maybe next class we can post that again, so that way people who don't have it. All right, well, thanks everybody. And I'll see you whenever, there's another class this month. I forget which day it is, but see you then.
Great, thanks very much.
Thank you.